Hello again. I'm not at all doctrinaire or inflexible in my thinking about race and any possible association of race with intelligence. Quite the opposite. I read anything I can find on this subject. The difficulty is that whereas those who espouse the course of scientific racism usually do so by providing facts and figures relating to things such as ethnicity and IQ tests, that sort of thing, those claiming to be ready to debunk the idea almost invariably resort to invective, insulting remarks which are essentially bare assertions that this or that belief is dangerous, wicked, or wrong. They don't use the language of science generally, but of the debating chamber. Here's Professor Steve Jones of University College London writing in his book The Language of Genes, which incidentally won a prestigious prize for the best science book of 1994. Much of the work on inherited differences in intellect between races is contemptible. What an extraordinary thing to say. Can you imagine writing that much of the work on cosmology is contemptible, or much of the work on cancer research is contemptible? It would sound really strange, but when talking about possible racial difference in intelligence, this is what passes for objective discussion. The question to ask, of course, is not whether the work is contemptible, but rather if it is correct. In the description to this video, I give a link to a piece written a year ago by a fellow called David Gilbourne, who is a professor of critical race studies at the University of Birmingham. What this actually entails, I have no idea, but I suppose we all have to earn a living somehow. A young man called Andrew Sabisky had been an aide in Downing Street until some tweets of his relating to his views that intellectual ability and ethnicity are linked came to light. Some viewers might remember this. It was about a year ago. Whereupon, of course, he had to leave abruptly. The article is called Is Dangerous Thinking About Race and IQ at the Heart of UK Government? I thought it would be interesting to see if the good professor can actually shed light on why he does not believe that race and IQ are connected. In other words, judging by the title of his article, he doesn't think there is a connection between race and IQ. Now, I'm open to persuasion. I read the thing hoping for some new information. It begins, an outrageous, racist and outdated belief in the innate intellectual inferiority of black people periodically re-enters public debate, usually masquerading as a bold initiative at the forefront of science, challenging convention and thinking the unthinkable. There now, that's how to put it. Doesn't he sound grand? However, this tells us little other than that the writer does not agree with the idea of racial difference in intelligence. Why doesn't he is the question I'm curious about. There's a bit of waffle and then he says, Sabisky's view that black people are genetically predetermined to be less intelligent than whites was widely attacked in the media and politics, yet the evidence suggests that his thinking about the nature of intelligence may not be entirely out of step with those in power in the UK. So far, all we know is that Professor Gilbourne apparently does not think there is any difference between the intellectual ability of different ethnic groups, and that he also has an idea that some people in the government do hold this belief. He goes on to talk about a press conference at which the Prime Minister's deputy spokesman refused more than 30 times to state Boris Johnson's views on eugenics and the supposed intellectual inferiority of black people. The press secretary repeatedly stated that the PM's views are well publicised and well documented. OK, so we don't know what Boris Johnson's views on eugenics are. Viewers are perhaps growing restless, and so was I by the time I had got this far. I expected an explanation of why there actually are no differences in cognitive ability between different groups. But all we know so far is that Professor Gilburn says that there are not, and that some people close to the British government think that there might be. I have been researching racism in education for more than 30 years, and at regular intervals this means revisiting the question of supposed racial differences in intelligence, a topic that refuses to die despite the wealth of evidence against it. Right, now we're getting somewhere. What is this wealth of evidence against the hypothesis? This is why I read this article, incidentally, because I want to see this evidence against that hypothesis. Okay, I'm sitting up and taking notice now. Unfortunately, Gilburn starts talking about something which the Prime Minister said about IQs in 2013, and the professor talks about how IQs are periodically recalibrated, which most of us know. Still nothing there about this wealth of evidence. Aha, here it comes now. A few years ago, I wrote a paper challenging many of the myths surrounding IQ. Right, now we're getting finally to the point. Oh no, now he talks about an essay which Dominic Cummings wrote years ago on the subject of intelligence. Nothing to do with race though. Gilburn ends this section by saying, I have called this strategy racial inexplicitness, a careful avoidance of clarity about race and education amid a long and winding discussion that prompts the reader to join the dots without ever stating where he thinks the dots lead us. Yes, I certainly see what you mean looking at this article. Still waiting for the wealth of evidence, Professor. Take your time. Now, the thing is, Professor Gilburn has noticed that one of the sources quoted at the end of Cummings' essay is a man called Professor Robert Plomin. I've never heard of him either. He's an American who is apparently a fan of the book The Bell Curve. Well, that's him damned. I had best quote the final two paragraphs verbatim, just so that viewers will know how Gilburn ends after all his rambling. These views are bad news for many groups in society, especially those deemed less gifted, and it's not so unlikely that we could see them entering policy. Despite the negative press coverage generated by Sabisky's beliefs, such dogma could conceivably be translated into a superficially acceptable policy brief. One way would be for education reforms to claim to apply scientific methods to identify the brightest and best and single them out for special attention. This would be presented as a meritocratic exercise intended to fast-track clever children regardless of their social background. The methods would include cognitive assessments, often a code for IQ tests, and the talk would be of social mobility and colour blindness, whereby the approach treats everyone as an individual. No one in authority would worry about the fact that such assessments seem to always place a disproportionate number of black kids in the less able bracket. That's how institutional racism works. And right there you have it. In the final two lines, Professor Gilburn agrees with me that when careful testing of intellectual ability is conducted, black children tend to score lower. Because, of course, that's how institutional racism works. Well, no, that's how IQ tests work, Professor. After all the build-up, that's it. I wish we could have been given just a glimpse of this wealth of evidence about which he wrote, but it's enough to know that he acknowledges what the available evidence actually does indicate. This is a classic example of how anti-racists and professors of critical race theory work. They deal not in facts, but ideology. People are condemned for the views they hold, but no attempt is made to explain in any detail why those views are wrong. I shall continue searching for actual evidence which contradicts my own views. I'm not bigoted and fixed in my opinions, but when I plough through a lot of nonsense like this, quite often I begin to think that there is no actual evidence against my own view.